What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Over the last 48 hours, several stories came together in a way that makes this daily briefing more interesting than a normal headline roundup. Because on one side, Ukraine appears to be showing signs of renewed offensive flexibility after a period when many people assumed that the battlefield had become almost completely frozen. On the other side, Russia is facing deeper pressure on its oil infrastructure and an ordinary life far from the front lines. And above all of that, there is also a larger strategic pattern forming, where cheaper Ukrainian drone adaptation, uncertain fuel logistics, NATO signaling, U.S. Ukraine talks, and even a telegram squeeze inside Russia are all pointing to the same uncomfortable conclusion for Moscow, is that this war is not becoming simpler for the Kremlin. It is becoming more expensive, more disruptive, and way harder to contain. The Wall Street Journal, for example, reports that Ukraine has achieved its biggest domestic territorial gains in more than 2 years after Russian forces lost use of Starlink, while the Financial Times says Kyiv claimed as much as 435 square kilometers regained, though independent estimates were lower, much lower, at around 213 square kilometers, with a net February gain last month of 37 square kilometers after Russian advances elsewhere. At the same time, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi says Russian forces launched 619 assault actions from March 17th to March 20th and suffered more than 6,090 casualties in those only 4 days alone, while Ukrainian strikes reached Primorsk in Leningrad Oblast and Ufa in Bashkortostan. And Reuters then also reports Ukraine's diesel imports are up 3% to nearly 17,000 metric tons a day, even as April remains still very uncertain. Add to that new U.S. Ukraine talks in Florida, a first high-level NATO delegation visit to Ukraine since the full-scale invasion, and then also rising frustration inside Russia over telegram restrictions. And now you will finally begin to see why today's briefing is not just about what happened here, what happened there, but about what may be changing underneath the whole surface. Here is the most surprising part. The most important thing about the latest battlefield reporting is not that Ukraine is suddenly marching forward everywhere, because that would be just a very hopeful wishful thinking and a fantasy, but that the idea of total Ukrainian paralysis looks now less convincing than it did just a few weeks ago. The Wall Street Journal once again says Ukraine's forces have achieved their biggest domestic territorial gains in more than 2 years after Russian troops lost access to Starlink, well, thanks, I guess, to Elon Musk, while other think tanks and media sources gave much more conservative estimates in terms of land regained. And that difference matters, because it tells you two things at once. First, Ukrainian officials' claims and independent mapping are not identical. And second, even the more conservative estimates still point to movement in a battlefield environment that many people had already started to describe as completely static. Now here's where things get a little bit tricky, because this does not mean Russian pressure has disappeared. In fact, Syrskyi said the exactly opposite. According to him, from March 17th through March 20th, Russian forces intensified offensive operations and carried out 619 assault actions across multiple directions, with the main effort concentrated on the Pokrovsk and Oleksandrivka front lines, where Ukrainian positions were attacked 163 times and 96 times respectively. He added that the Kostiantynivka direction remained highly tense with 84 assault actions, while the Ocheretyno, Lyman and Kupiansk sectors recorded more than 150 combat engagements combined. Then comes the number that gives the whole chapter its significance. Syrskyi said that Russian forces suffered more than 6,090 casualties over those 4 days and about 8,710 over the week, while still failing to achieve their objectives in several directions. So, what does this all then really mean? It means we may be looking at a battlefield where Russia can still generate enormous assault pressure, still commit reserves, still keep many sectors hot at the same time, but where that pressure is no longer automatically translating into the simple momentum story that Moscow wants to sell so much, both domestically and internationally. If Russia is increasing assault intensity across Pokrovsk, Oleksandrivka, Kostiantynivka, Ocheretyno, Lyman and Kupiansk, and if Ukraine is still capable of local advances elsewhere while inflicting heavy attrition, then the more accurate description is not that Russia is unstoppable or that Ukraine has suddenly turned everything around, turned the tables, is winning the war, but something more serious and more useful for analysis. And this thing is that the contest is still alive. The costs are still enormous, and the side that adapts better may matter more than the side that simply attacks harder. And that matters for the rest of today's briefing, because if the front line is not fully frozen, then everything else behind the front line becomes much more important too, including deep strikes, energy pressure, logistics, alliance support, and public mood inside Russia itself. In other words, once battlefield movement becomes possible again, even on a limited scale, every other supporting layer starts to matter way more. And that takes us directly to the next chapter, where Ukraine is trying to make the war feel less distant inside Russia itself. And by the way, guys, if you want to see some uncensored footage from Ukraine, please go ahead and check my Patreon. Free trial is still available, so well, it I guess doesn't hurt to try. The link is down below, thanks so much, now let's continue. In just a second I will reveal something most people overlook. A deep strike is not only about physical damage, it is also about psychology. Because every time Ukraine reaches further into the Russian territory, it challenges one of the central promises of the Kremlin system, which is the promise that ordinary Russians can mostly live their normal lives while war remains somewhere distant, somewhere else. Well, as you can see, that promise is getting way harder to maintain. Ukraine's General Staff confirmed strikes overnight on March 23rd against the Transneft oil terminal in the port of Primorsk in Leningrad region and the Bashneft-Ufaneftekhim refinery in Ufa, Bashkortostan. Primorsk, for example, handles around 60 million tons of oil annually and is Russia's main export oil hub on the Baltic Sea, while the port itself lies approximately 1,087 kilometers or 675 miles from Ukraine's nearest border point. According to the General Staff, a fuel tank and oil loading infrastructure were hit, causing an ongoing fire at the facility. Now imagine all this from the Russian side. Primorsk is not a frontline town. Ufa is not a border settlement. These are places linked to the wider machinery that allows Russia to finance, export, and normalize wartime endurance. So when strikes reach that far, the message is bigger than the visible damage. And that is exactly what the Kyiv's independence broader analysis argues, saying that Ukraine's deep strike campaign is making Russians feel that the war now is affecting them more directly, not just in the border regions, but in the rear regions as well. Analysts such as Andriy Sukharina told the outlet that in heavily affected areas, residents live in a state of so-called constant anxiety because of regular drone strikes, air defense activity, internet outages and sirens, while public reactions are polarizing between harder demands for escalation and then also growing fatigue with authorities that fail to provide just basic security. Here's where it gets interesting, because the article also knows that some of the highest human losses are concentrated in Russia's national republics and industrial regions, including Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, Sverdlovsk, Chelyabinsk and Volgograd. That is a very important detail, because it tells you that the war's burden is not distributed evenly across Russia. It almost does not reach Moscow, unless some drones or anything. And that is also the political center talks in grand strategic language, but the social and human cost lands hardest in regions that are often way less wealthy, less visible, and way more expendable in Moscow's internal hierarchy. So when Bashkortostan appears in both the casualty conversation and the refinery strike conversation, that's not just geography anymore. It is a window into how the war is reshaping Russia's own internal balance. And that's not all, because once civilians start hearing sirens, dealing with internet disruptions and watching energy facilities in faraway regions catch fire suddenly, the Kremlin faces a harder communications problem. It can still say everything is under control, it can still say air defenses are working, it can still insist that the strategic situation is stable, but those narratives become way more difficult to sell when the map of disruptions keeps expanding. This is why deep strikes matter far beyond the visible footage. They do not need to shut down the Russian economy to create strategic discomfort, not at all, even though this will be obviously hugely advantageous. They only need to make daily life feel less predictable, less safe and less insulated from the war. And once that starts happening, the next question naturally becomes how Ukraine is managing to create this pressure so consistently. Which now, as you can see guys, which takes us directly straight to the technology chapter, where chip adaptation may be one of the most important stories in the war right now. Let's talk about it. This is what changed everything. For a long time, people talked about advanced Western systems as if modern war would be decided only by those who had the most expensive hardware. But the AP's reporting on Ukraine's drone adaptation shows something completely different, which is that cost-efficient innovation can change the battlefield faster than the prestige systems ever could. AP describes how Ukraine's 127th Brigade is building an air defense model centered on interceptor and drone crews, and one pilot even gave an example that says more than any think tank chart ever could. He basically said that a Patriot missile costs about $2 million, while a small interceptor aircraft can cost around $2,200, and if it misses, it can still be sometimes landed, repaired and just sent back up. It's not just a tactical anecdote, it's a new economic logic of the entire war. And here's the part that pleasantly surprised me the most, while confirming, I would say, the most obvious assumptions. According to the same AP article, this adaptation is not the result of some leisurely innovation cycle, where planners calmly debated doctrine in just conference rooms. No, one pilot even put it in brutally simple terms. We did it because we had nothing else, we had no other choice. In other words, necessity is not just inspiring invention here, it is accelerating it at the speed of survival. Ukrainian crews are reusing even drones designed to be disposable, studying their weaknesses, modifying them, and turning battlefield scarcity into innovation loop. That is the very important point, because it helps explain why Ukraine can remain dangerous, even when broader industrial and manpower realities still look very difficult. The strategic significance becomes even bigger when you connect this to the Middle East and the wider drone environment. AP knows that the President Vladimir Zelensky says that U.S. allies in the Middle East have approached Ukraine for help in defending against those Iranian drones, the very same class of systems that Russia has fired by tens of thousands during the war. AP then also knows that Iranian drone used in retaliation for joint US-Israeli strikes has at times stressed far more sophisticated Western-made air defenses, again underscoring why cheap, flexible countermeasures matter. So this is no longer only a Ukrainian story. Ukraine is becoming a live laboratory for the kind of drone defense model many countries may soon need. Now here's potentially the game changer. When you combine this chapter with the previous one, the picture becomes much clearer. Deep strikes into Primorsk and Ufa matter, but they matter even more if Ukraine can keep learning faster than Russia can ever adapt. But then, when you combine this chapter with the first one, everything starts making absolute sense. Because local battlefield gains are easier to imagine when one side is continuously changing the tactical equation at lower cost. That does not erase Ukraine's constraints, obviously, and it certainly does not mean that every single drone solution scales easily. But it does suggest, at least, that the war's next phase may reward flexibility over just sheer volume more than many expected. And if that is true, then the next issue is not only how Ukraine fights, but how it keeps the country supplied well enough to sustain that fight. Which brings us to a quieter, but absolutely essential, unfortunately, chapter for them. The chapter about fuel. At this point, you might be wondering why diesel deserves a full chapter at a war briefing. And the answer is quite simple. Because armies, generators, repair crews, emergency services and transport networks do not just run on slogans and promises. Reuters reports that Ukraine's diesel market is supplied through the end of March, with daily imports up 3% to nearly 17,000 metric tons. And the monthly total could reach 522,000 tons, almost the same as March 2025. On the surface that sounds reassuring, stable, but Reuters adds that April is uncertain, with suppliers delaying decisions and one trader even saying that no one is naming specific volumes, guarantees or premiums just yet. The next part is crucial, so please pay closer attention, because the article also reminds readers why this issue exists in the first place. Russian strikes virtually destroyed Ukraine's domestic refining capacity, which means that the country became almost entirely dependent on imported fuel from Western, Central and Southern Europe. That means almost every discussion about Ukraine's resilience has to include a less glamorous but extremely important and serious question. can imported flows remain stable enough, affordable enough, and predictable enough to support both military and civilian demand if the wider energy environment becomes even more volatile? And that question matters even more now because the oil market is already being affected by the war in the Middle East. So, what does this really mean in practical terms? It means that simply March is manageable, but April is a test of confidence. Not a collapse story, not a panic story, but a confidence story. Traders hesitate when prices rise and when risks multiply. Governments can urge resilience, but import chains rely on actual contracts, actual volumes, and actual margins. The battlefield may reward improvisation, but fuel chains reward predictability. So if Ukraine enters April with continued uncertainty over volumes and pricing, that does not mean disaster, but it does mean one more variable that Kyiv has to manage while also dealing with assaults across Pokrovsk, Oleksandrivka, Kostiantynivka, Lyman, and Kupiansk. And here is why this chapter connects directly to the next one. When Ukraine struggles with fuel uncertainty, Russia's own energy revenues are simultaneously getting a boost from higher global prices. So the next question is not only whether Ukraine can sustain imports, but whether Moscow is getting a new financial cushion at exactly the moment when the war's costs remain extremely heavy. That leads us into one of the most revealing stories of the day, because Putin himself is now signaling very unambiguously that the energy money has to be handled carefully. Let's talk about it right now. There is a twist to this that most people miss. When Putin tells officials to make quote-unquote balanced decisions about energy revenues, that's not only a statement of confidence, it is also a sign of concern. Reuters reports that Putin on March 23rd told the government to make balanced decisions on how to use newly boosted state revenues from energy exports amid a spike in global prices. He also stressed the need to shield the economy and public accounts from external risks, and therefore asked Russia's oil companies to use this additional revenue to pay back their massive debts to banks. Reuters adds that before this month's sharp rise in oil and other energy prices due to the war in the Middle East, Russia had been dealing with falling budget revenues caused by a larger discount on its oil because of Western sanctions and by a strong ruble. Now here is the important part. Yes, higher prices can give Moscow relief. Yes, extra energy revenue can improve the fiscal mood in the short term. But if Putin is simultaneously warning about external risks and pointing to large corporate debts, then the picture is not one of carefree abundance. It is closer to this, which is Russia may be catching a temporary support in prices, but it is doing so from a position where sanctions, discounts, currency effects, and debt burdens have already created big stress. It is not weakness in the sense of immediate collapse, but it is vulnerability in the sense that Russia still needs favorable conditions just to keep the machine running smoothly. And here is where this story becomes strategically interesting. On one side, Ukraine is hitting infrastructure like Primorsk, a Baltic export hub handling around 60 million tons annually. On the other side, Putin is telling his system to be careful with the windfall created by higher prices. Put those together, and the energy picture stops looking just one way to just Russia's advantage. It starts looking like a contest between financial cushioning and strategic disruption. Ukraine may not be able to erase Russia's energy advantage completely, not in the near future or if ever, but it can complicate it for sure, increasing risks around it, and force then Moscow to spend political and operational attention on protecting the very system that finances the war. But that's only half of the story, because money alone does not end wars. There is also diplomacy, and over the weekend Ukraine and the United States concluded another round of talks. So the question now becomes whether the military and economic pressures we have just talked about are strong enough to influence the political track, or whether the political track is still lagging behind the reality of the battlefield. Let's dig into that, because there are some very important details here that we have to discuss. Here is where it gets even more interesting. Reuters reports that Ukrainian and U.S. delegations concluded a second day of talks in Florida, aimed at finding ways to end the 4-year war with Russia. President Vladimir Zelensky said a new prisoner of war exchange may be possible, and Reuters notes that Russian representatives were not present in those talks, even though they had originally been expected and even invited, and the negotiations were just even due to even take place in a completely other place, in Abu Dhabi, before shifting to once again Florida. The Reuters summary also highlights two other details that matter for framing. Zelensky called for tougher sanctions on Russia, and the broader meeting context includes European national security advisors in Kyiv, led on the Ukrainian side by Rustem Umerov, Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council. One of the most important details in this whole diplomatic picture is not what was achieved, but what was missing. Russian representatives, once again, were not there. Surprise, surprise. That means that the political track still carries the familiar problem of asymmetry. Kyiv and Washington can discuss frameworks, pressure tools, and humanitarian mechanisms such as POW exchanges, but the path to any durable settlement still runs through a Russian position that remains highly uncertain, delayed, or deliberately vague. So while headlines about talks, quote-unquote, naturally attract attention, the more honest interpretation is that these meetings are about shaping conditions rather than producing immediate breakthroughs. That does not mean they are unimportant, quite the opposite. If there are no some sort of talks at all, that's even a bigger problem, right? So the value of even such small talks is that they are aligned priorities. They show political continuity and signal to Moscow that support structures are still functioning. But viewers should resist the temptation to imagine a straight line from weekend talks to near-term settlement. The battlefield still remains active, Ukrainian diesel for April remains uncertain, Russian energy revenues just got a price-driven lift, and Ukraine is still carrying out deep strikes on the Russian infrastructure on the Russian territory. In that environment, diplomacy is not floating above the war like some cloud of reason. No, it is operating inside the very same pressure system as everything else. And this is what matters. So guys, if you want more daily briefings like this with the battlefield, geopolitics, economy, technology, diplomacy, even domestic Russian angle, all stitched into one bigger picture, please subscribe and like this video, because over the next few days we may get a clear answer to whether this is just a temporary fluctuation, just some kind of separate news, or even the beginning of a more meaningful shift. Don't forget about the Patreon, link is down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
All they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe